Whatever path one might take to approach the subject of work, inevitably the path ends at the political. I'm happy to say that tonight we have local, provincial, and federal politicians with us. They will be here as resource people and to hear what you have to say. I encourage you at the reception following the evening's work to approach them, ask your questions, give them your opinions. First, it is my pleasure to introduce to you the Mayor of Castlegar, Her Worship, Mayor Audrey Moore.
Well, good evening, everybody. It's nice to see so many old friends in the gathering this evening. I've been asked to be very brief, and I never really need to be reminded about that because I have difficulty speaking for any length of time. I think your program looks extremely interesting. I unfortunately can't be here with you tomorrow because I'm going to be working, and I'm going to be working at the Regional District of Central Kootenay. I look forward this evening to hearing your principal speaker, and I think your subject is well chosen, having been involved with the sort of beginnings of the women's movement in the Kootenays. It's nice to see it has come so far. So good luck, enjoy your conference, welcome to Castlegar.
Thank you, Mayor Moore. Next, I would like to introduce the Member of Parliament for Kootenay West, Lyle Christiansen.
Thanks very much, Bonnie, and I'd like to begin by congratulating both the Kootenay Center for a Sustainable Future and Selkirk College Continuing Education for putting together a seminar and a conference that examines a subject, hopefully in some depth and with some new insights that requires a lot of study and a lot of work. I think one of the first questions we'll probably have to ask ourselves is, both as human beings individually and collectively when considering the full range of subjects that's before you, is whether we as individuals and we as various collectives live to work or work to live. Because in deciding that, and that can be taken in more than just a personal way, it can also be rephrased to ask ourselves whether or not we want to design individuals in the future or design communities to fit the perceived needs of some marketplace which is owned and controlled by whomever or whatever, or whether or not we have to take whatever steps we deem necessary at a local, regional, provincial, and or national level to ensure that our economic institutions are designed first and foremost to serve our needs both as individuals and our needs and existence as a community or as communities. Because one of the curious things over the last number of years with the growing trend to computerization and all the electronic technology is at the same time that the technology is making it possible to decentralize decision making and decentralize living arrangements in communities as never before. We seem to be stuck in a pattern where instead of using that technology to decentralize and to diversify and to put decision making out into communities, it's being used to this point more and more to centralize power and centralize decision making and centralize populations. We've seen closure after closure of various service industries that used to exist and provide wage or salary paying employment to hundreds of our neighbors within the West Kootenay, moved to other centers of British Columbia and other parts of the country. So we just don't seem to have our priorities right if, in fact, as I suspect, what we want to do is to design our economy to the extent that we can to serve our needs as individuals and communities. But that's just one of the host of areas that I know you're going to be examining. It's an area in which I've had a lifelong interest. And just on a lighter note, one I was working for some 20 years in the lumber industry. One of the things I always argued for, but I could never quite find a mechanism to make it all that practical as yet, was to try to devise arrangements whereby instead of always waiting until 55 or age 60 or age 65 to retire, people would be able to retire for 4 or 5 years in midlife while they still had their family at home. Well, due to the exigencies of the political process, I kind of lucked into that situation and had 4 years exactly at a time when I would have chosen it, and I can tell you, it was great. I got a chance to do things with my family, to get to know them individually, got a chance to do things in the arts community that I hadn't done since I was in my teens, and kind of really renewed myself as an individual. And I'd recommend that course to anyone that can do it. Hopefully you'll be able to plan it and not just stumble into it in the way that I did. But it does work, and it just convinced me that the kind of goals of flexibility in terms of working time that I'd argued for years would work and would be useful and worthwhile for individuals. And again, that's just one area from personal example that I was glad to find out that my dreams at least were a reality as far as myself was concerned. Anyway, good luck with the conference. I will be around all of this evening and most of tomorrow. There is a Soviet Writers Conference going on over at the Brilliant Cultural Center that I'm going to have to spend a bit of time to as well getting over to and visiting there. But as much as I can participate and learn from you, I'll certainly be here. Thank you very much, and good luck in your conference.
Thank you, Lyle. So, from the federal scene to the provincial scene, our next speaker is member of the Legislative Assembly from British Columbia for the constituency of Rossland-Trail, Chris Darcy.
Thanks, Bonnie. I want to congratulate everyone who is participating and whoever has taken steps to see that this conference comes about. You know, so-called work has changed a whole lot in the last few years, and it's going to change a lot more. We have been disabused, I think, as a society in recent years of the notion that there ever is or ever was such a thing as a permanent job. Nothing occupationally is permanent. In a way, thank heaven for that. The notion that people were always going to be locked into something, either societally or by their own choice, is really quite absurd when you think about the limited number of years that we have to live here. And I also think it's quite important that you people think especially about the fulfilling and sustaining ways that people can occupy themselves in a holistic sense, as well as in the traditional material sense that we associate with occupations or work. I always think the luckiest people in the world are the ones who are doing something that they really want to do, rather than something that they don't really care to do, but they do because they have to sustain themselves and sustain their family. Also, I think that I hate the term, but scenarios, the options, the potentials that you people identify and the consensuses you come to will be very important, I think, for elected people, because I was going to say all too often, almost universally, we lag behind what is happening in society. Probably a perfect example is wage gender parity, which is something that all politicians and political parties are way behind on, should have happened years ago, and it's only now being thought about in a significant way. So, good for you all. Think lots about things. And tell people in my capacity when you're done, and maybe we won't always lag behind you as much as we do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. We do have one other politician here this evening. MLA for Kootenay, Ann Edwards, just arrived. Ann, would you stand up so people can see who you are? So there's one more. Our keynote speaker this evening currently occupies the chair in Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University. She is an economist who teaches at the Ontario Institute of Studies and Education. She is the author of many books, articles, and papers, including a chapter of last year's Canadian bestseller, or if it wasn't, it should have been, If You Love This Country. I'm sure everyone here read it. She is author of Women's Work, Markets, and Economic Development in 19th Century Ontario, a title I struggled to memorize before this evening and absolutely couldn't. Published by the University of Toronto Press, and Free Trade and the Future of Women's Work, Manufacturing and Service Industries, published by Garamond Press. For the past 3 years, she has been actively involved in the movement against free trade. She is Vice President of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, co-chair of the Coalition Against Free Trade in Toronto, and a spokesperson for the Pro-Canada Network. It is with great pleasure that I introduce to you Dr. Marjorie Cohen.
I'm very pleased to be here. I am not the chair at Women's Studies this year at Simon Fraser. I will be next year. So I will be out in BC for a whole year, and I'm looking forward to it very much. I think whenever we think of the whole prospect of work and the future, we've been instilled with this sense that there is a great change about to take place. The message from government in business is that the world is changing very, very rapidly, and we in Canada are in very grave danger of losing our position if we don't successfully adapt. Business is presented to us as really ready for this challenge, that they're quite prepared to respond to the demands of a pure market mechanism. But it's workers who will need to be forced to adapt. And it is workers who are more likely to resist the necessary changes which have to take place. So labor force adjustment is the phrase which is the focal point for issues related to work these days. The direction we're headed is presented to us, at least the direction of our whole economy, as inevitable. A result of worldwide economic forces which are entirely beyond the power of any particular nation to be able to control. And besides, we're told it's also going to be good for us, should we be able to manage to adapt, eventually anyway. So the future of work is indeed an economic problem, but it's also a political one. And the future is shaped by people, not abstract forces. The real issue, I think, is who, that is, which groups, are going to control the shape of our future. I contend that if we continue in the direction we're headed, we will indeed get where we're going. And I think that's problematic because it's not where I think most of us will want to be. Is that convoluted? But anyway, I will proceed. Economics, I'm an economist, and economics is referred to as the dismal profession, and for very good reason. And I want to talk to you a bit about the state of the Canadian economy and where we're likely to be headed in the future. I wish I could break with the tradition of my profession and give you a message of real optimism, one of joy and anticipation of new directions. But I can't do this because I think that the direction of Canada's economic policies are decidedly wrong-headed, and that the move toward greater reliance on pure private market forces will not solve our economic and social problems, but will actually make them a whole lot worse. Nevertheless, I am also an incurable optimist, and I do truly believe that people have the capacity to shape the society in which they live. So my entire message will not be calculated to depress and immobilize you, I hope. And I think what has happened is that we've seen through the whole fight against free trade the beginning of real solidarity in a strong popular movement. And I think we can build on this to ensure that this country grows in a way which is consistent with a collective view of what we want the country to be. But I want to talk for a bit about the Canadian economy. Much of what is occurring in Canada is a result of what's happening in the global economy. But it's not the whole story. It also has to do with the way certain kinds of economic problems and social problems have been identified. Now, within the past 10 years, there really have been massive changes in the way production and distribution of things and services have been organized on a global scale. Technological improvements in communications and transportation in particularly, they have particularly greatly accelerated the ability of very large multinational corporations to shift production of manufacturing, resources, agriculture, services to parts of the world where labor costs are relatively lower than they are here in Canada. Now, these are absolutely gigantic corporations. The United Nations Center on Transnational Corporations has identified 600 corporations in this world which have annual sales of over $1 billion a year. And these only 600 companies in this world, they estimate, account for 25% of the total worldwide production of this world. They account for between 80 and 90% of the exports of industrialized countries like Britain, the United States, and Canada. So they're truly in control. They employ 3% of the world's labor force. These corporations are absolutely gigantic. When you compare the annual sales of the corporations to the annual income of a nation like Canada, that is all we produce and sell in this country, they are bigger than a great many countries in the world. General Motors alone is about the third of the size of Canada. Toyota is larger than Greece, New Zealand, and Portugal. The Royal Dutch Shell Group is about the same size as Finland, Denmark, and Norway. These are absolutely gigantic, powerful economic entities. Now, we often have notions that national interests can somehow direct economic events within a country, that we somehow have national decisions which are made in the interest of the people and the nation about how to pursue things like a competitive advantage. But more and more nations are being manipulated by what appears to be the pure workings of a market mechanism. But this is really not so. The real planning and the real manipulation of the world economy is in the hands of these giant private firms. Everyone else adjusts to what is in their interest. This is essentially why we get into things like the free trade deal. Canada's response to this gigantic corporate concentration which is happening worldwide is essentially to make corporate concentration easier here than other places. We already have the greatest degree of corporate concentration than any other nation, any other industrialized nation. And our laws are already among the most lax. That is, it's very easy for corporate concentration to occur in Canada. So mergers and acquisitions are very rarely monitored in any kind of way, I mean, almost never. And it's certainly what we do anticipate in the near future is a lot more of these to take place. But what is very, very clear, it is no accident that international corporations are now shifting production to countries which often have the most repressive governments, or governments which have either little concern about or little ability to control the health, safety, and the income levels of their workers. These are countries where trade unions are virtually non-existent and where and which have draconian labor policies which are viewed as really providing an actually favorable atmosphere for business to succeed. This is why companies like Bata Shoes wants to locate in South Africa, or Union Carbide wants to go to the Far East. One businessman in Mexico, U.S. businessman in Mexico, recently explained the advantage it was to being in Mexico rather than in the United States or Canada. He said, "There's no welfare here. You can punish Mexican workers. There's also the 48-hour week. You don't see any horsing around here, no queues for the water fountain or the bathroom. These girls work." We are seeing the development of world market factories to meet the needs of large international corporations, and this has not served poor countries well at all. In the past 20 years, third world economic development strategies, which had in the past emphasized the promotion of national industries, integrated economies, and decreased dependence on imports from Western countries, these kinds of initiatives were scrapped. The strategies now promoted by organizations like the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund stress export-led growth for these countries. Altogether, countries are becoming more and more dependent on each other. Now, this is fine as long as the international market mechanism works and functions really well. The problem is that things often go really, really wrong. And when they do, those countries which are most dependent on trade and are least able to sustain their own populations by their own production of food and consumer needs, these are the countries which suffer the most. They get into debt, and a process is put into place where they must continually scramble for ways to export more and become even more tied to the international whims of the market. Now, this is happening in Canada as well. Now, of course, there are some very, very notable differences between Canada and poorer countries in the world. We are intrinsically a wealthy country. We have a good resource base, we have a skilled labor force, and we're certainly not a poor nation. But we are becoming more and more a nation driven by export-led growth. During the past 30 years, the focus of our economic policy on exports has grown enormously. In the 1960s, about 20% of our national income was a result of exports. In the 1980s, this has grown to 30% of our national income devoted to exports. Canada is much more tied to the international economy than most other countries in the world, even countries we think of as great trading nations. For example, Japan, a great trading nation, has 15% of its national income devoted to exports. United States has 10%. We have 30%. What this means is that Canada becomes extraordinarily vulnerable to shifts in the international economy. We saw this very, very dramatically during the Depression period we had from 82 to 84. And we are also very, very much more vulnerable to the whims of the United States economy. We have 80% of our trade with the United States, so it's very, very highly concentrated. What I think is important to see is to look at how this increased reliance on exports has affected our economy so far. That is, has it lessened our economic problems? We've increased from 20% to 30%, and yet this is what the government is telling us now. We have to even have a greater proportion of our national income devoted to exports. Well, what determines whether any economic program is successful is how you define an economic problem. I think that probably people in this room would tend to define an economic problem very, very differently from the way our government tends to define an economic problem. I think what we have to recognize is that increased economic activity because of trade has not lessened the economic weaknesses of Canada. These are the things that I see as a problem for Canada. First, gross regional inequalities. Of all the OECD countries, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which was really an organization of industrialized countries, Western industrialized countries, Canada has the highest degree of inequality between our regions. We are distinguished by that fact. We also have chronically high rates of unemployment. Now, this is masked somewhat by relatively better performance in Ontario and Quebec. But outside of central Canada, it is chronic. And what happens is that whenever things go wrong in the international economy, Canada gets hit first, hardest, and longest. So that our unemployment rates are higher than others, they last longer, and our unemployment problem is deeper. The third problem I see that Canada has is a very highly skewed distribution of income. That is, what we are seeing is that the poor are not getting a little bit better off. The rich are not losing a little bit of their own money, but it's the other way around. The rich, of course, are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer by small degrees. But this is in spite of what appears to be redistributive kinds of social policies. These inequalities are not changing, whether we're talking about people between regions, certain kinds of groups of people like women and men, or whether we're talking about the nation as a whole. The fourth thing that I think is problematic is a poor provision of social services. Once again, we're one of the worst of industrialized countries. We tend to pat ourselves on the back in Canada about our delivery of social services because we compare ourselves with the United States. We look good in comparison with the US. But compared to other industrialized countries, we do not do very well. We spend a smaller proportion of our national income on social services than most other industrialized countries in the OECD. We're only better than the United States. Now, I think that there are very important reasons why enhanced trade does not solve economic problems. By the way, enhanced trade, it means having a larger proportion of our national income devoted to trade. That's the objective of this government. We have trade surpluses. That is, we tend to export more than we import in things which rise from the primary sector. That is, live animals and resources with very little processing done to them. That is, we export things which have relatively low labor content. Less than 10% of our whole labor force is engaged in work in the areas where we have trade surpluses. We consistently maintain a trade deficit, that is, we import more than we export, in manufactured things and in services. And that's where 90% of the people in this country work, in these areas. So as a result of our trade structure, we have a very poor integration between our resource base and our manufacturing and our service sectors. We have very high rates of unemployment in the areas of our country which are devoted to resource exports. We have an extremely volatile economy, and we have a poor distribution of income. And I think it is precisely because of our trade structure that we have this problem. So what I think will happen as we make our economy even more dependent on trade is that we will have more of the same, but actually at an accelerated rate. So the problem, as I see it, is that what the government has designed to solve our economic problems will not only not solve them, but actually exacerbate them. The point that I want to make tonight is that how economic problems are defined is not an economic issue per se, but is a political issue. And how work-related issues are treated in public policy is very much associated with the priorities which are identified as economic problems. So if unemployment is seen as an economic problem, then you have certain kinds of policies, public policies, which are designed to eliminate unemployment. But unemployment is not a problem for certain sectors of the economy. It is not a problem for business. In fact, unemployment is a very good thing for business. I'll get to this in a moment. The government right now has three priorities with regard to public policy. One is to improve the climate for business to increase exports. Two is to fight inflation. And three is to cut the deficit. The philosophy behind this this direction of public policy, I think, was best summed up by the words of the premier of this province, Bill Vander Zalm. He said, "By strengthening the strong, we can best help the weak." And I think actually most politicians don't say things quite as boldly as Vander Zalm does, but the sentiment is essentially the same. Public policy must focus on creating the right climate for the most powerful sectors of business in this country, the multinational corporations. Now, when I don't know how you feel about reading the business sections of the newspapers. I'm sort of addicted to them and read them, Financial Post and the business section of the Globe and Mail every day with breakfast. And one of the things that I have noticed lately is it's really hard to distinguish the good news from the bad news when you're reading these economic writers. The problem, I mean, most of us think, when you have a reduction in the unemployment rate, that this is actually good news. Not so if you read Peter Cook of the Globe and Mail. His problem, as he sees for the business climate in Canada, is that the unemployment rate is becoming too low. Now, you may remember that when the McDonald Commission report came out, they identified this sort of magical thing called NAIRU, the non-accelerating income rate of unemployment. What NAIRU is the period, the level of unemployment below which you do not want unemployment to drop. So what they said is essentially when Canada's unemployment rate is between 6 and 8%, that's full employment. If it gets lower than that, you're going to have real problems in the economy. So you don't want to have any kind of economic policy which is going to reduce the unemployment rate below, let's say, 8%. Now, the reason for this, of course, that they say, what they are explaining is that when it gets below that, you tend to have prices rise. Now, why do prices rise? They rise because you don't have hordes of people out there competing with each other for jobs, and then businesses suddenly have to begin to raise wages in order to get people to work for them. So this is actually a very bad thing for business when you have unemployment rates too low, because it essentially means they have to pay higher wages, their profits are lowered, and things aren't as good for them. Now, what has happened in Canada recently is actually quite interesting, because during the past 10 years, we have actually had a consistent drop in real wages. That is, what people can actually buy with the income that they get, correcting the money wage for inflation. In the past, since the Tories have been in power, we've actually had a 5.6 drop in real wages. At the same time, we've had rather dramatic rises in profits. For example, last year, profits increased by over 50%. Yet it is the threat of wage demands which most captures government and business attention now. By the way, this is not actual wage demands. This is the threat of wage demands, which everybody is very, very worried about. So workers don't want to keep losing ground, and they're trying to recover some of the value of their income. So they're going on strike in order to have maybe a 4% a year increase. That would roughly keep them in place with inflation for a while. Now, this is seen essentially, wage demands are seen as fueling inflation. Not the huge increases in profits that we've seen, but the threat of workers' demands. And so what we have seen is, absolutely draconian economic measures put into place to fight what government perceives as our soaring inflation rate, which has increased from 4% last year to 4.3% this year. I think this is an incredibly heavy-handed response on the part of government. And what they're doing is instituting an extremely tight money policy, which I predict will get considerably worse. We have, right now, the highest real interest rates that we've had since the Depression. I don't mean money interest rates, but real interest rates. That is when you correct for inflation. The real interest rate now is 7%. But the money rate, as you know, is considerably higher. These are the highest since the Depression. And the effect of this is really quite extraordinary, because a tight money policy is really instituted because you suspect that there's a problem around excess consumer demand. People are buying too much, so it's there aren't enough things to buy, they have too much money, and so it's bidding the price of things up. Of course, this isn't what's causing our slight increase in prices. But what happens when you do things to lessen consumer demand is it tends to have not much of an effect on the price level, but rather dramatic effects on the level of employment. Because, of course, what happens is when you affect consumer spending and you discourage it, then businesses can't sell what they're already producing, so they lay off workers. And then you have a downward spiral effect. When workers are laid off, they can't buy so much, and so on and so on. I think if this policy continues, this restrictive monetary policy will force Canada into another recession, an absolutely unnecessary recession. Now, for business and for government, unemployment simply is not an economic problem. In fact, if we have higher levels of unemployment, this will be quite a good thing for business. It will make Canada more competitive. It will mean that business will be able to resist all kinds of demands from labor, for instance, equality demands from women, demands for better and safer workplaces, and so on. But labor is a problem. Unemployment isn't a problem, but labor is a problem. And the problems around labor tended to be viewed, or put forward at least, as one which is a mismatch between what business wants and needs and what people are really able to do. So business and lobby groups talk a whole lot about training as a solution to the problems, as though inadequate skills is the real reason why people are unemployed in Canada. So in fact, what you really hear them talking about a lot, or at least see them writing about in the Financial Post in the business section, is investment in human capital. That's what we are, human capital. And what they want to do is to have the focus of the investment in terms of training and education, focus on excellence. And there is a particular focus on providing more training in knowledge-based industries. We are also seeing more and more the gospel of individual self-reliance and independence from state handouts being trotted out. The notion that real success in life can come to those who sincerely want to stand on their own 2 feet. There is no real understanding of how the odds are often stacked against the individual. Now, it's true, people can influence their own employability by acquiring the right skills or being in the right location at the right time. But if the system requires, and in fact encourages, some people not to work and others to be underemployed at least, the power of individuals to provide for themselves is really extraordinarily limited. The problem with focusing on skills, which is what government would have us do, is that the real problem is then whitewashed. And that is the problem of really not enough good jobs. There really is no clear notion of where new good jobs in any case, are going to be coming from. We keep talking about labor adjustment and adjustment policies and the notion that we should expand knowledge-based industries, but there is no evidence that in fact there is going to be a rapid expansion of these areas in Canada. The trend we know is not in this direction, but is in another direction. So the trend is not for well-paid, high-tech, full-time jobs, but rather toward low-wage jobs in service industries, with many being either part-time or temporary. And in some respects, the growth of part-time work has been quite extraordinary, and I think most people are familiar with this now. But what is interesting is that it is extraordinarily understated in the statistics that we receive. And this is primarily because what Statistics Canada does is gather all kinds of jobs together. For example, if one individual has 2 or 3 part-time jobs in order to have enough in order to survive, that's counted as working full-time. So we don't really have a notion of the extent of part-time jobs in Canada. And one of the ways in which this training is going to take place that the government is pushing for is to get funding from the unemployment insurance scheme. So the attempt, and what is always being thrown out as kind of a trial balloon now, is that what we will do is target unemployment insurance better, reduce the number of people who receive unemployment insurance, take that extra money and put it toward training, not give it to the unemployed. I think there are a couple of issues that I think that are going to be extremely important and have a big effect on the level of employment and the character of employment in the next short while. One of these is the value of the Canadian dollar. As a result of Canada's recent tight money policy, the value of the Canadian dollar has gone up extraordinary. It has risen 14% since '87. Going up from 72 cents to 83 cents. Now, for consumers who buy things from other countries, this is actually good news. The things we buy cost us less money. However, it becomes very, very bad for Canadian producers and for the workers in those industries. Because essentially what happens when you have a rise in the dollar like that is that it amounts to basically a 14% surtax on everything we send out of this country. And as you know, we send a lot out of Canada. So the rise in the price of the dollar is far more significant to Canada than the elimination over a 10-year period of the tariff, which has an average, the average tariff, by the way, is 5% across the board. So eliminating a 5% tariff over 10 years gives us, it's virtually imperceptible to exporters vis-a-vis the United States, and we can expect more things to be imported in this country and less to be produced here. The other thing that we have to worry about is what is going to happen around the deficit and tax increases. We have a large government deficit, and it's very, very clear that the government intends to increase taxes and of course, reduce certain kinds of spending that we have, particularly around social programs. But the problem with raising taxes is how are they going to do it? And of course, they have another problem too, which certainly was not a problem we had around expenditures last year, and that is, as tariffs are reduced, you increase the deficit by $2 or $3 billion a year. And what we see happening now is there are now negotiations to actually reduce those tariffs sooner. So we are going to see big increases, I think, in the deficit. Now, Finance Minister Wilson, of course, has a solution to the problem around the deficit, and one solution is to introduce a massive sales tax in Canada. We now have a federal sales tax on some manufactured items, but this will be a massive sales tax which will include virtually everything. At one point he said he would exclude food. His latest statement is nothing is excluded. So this means that every time we buy our kids clothes, ride a bus, go to the dentist, buy a house, have a bank transaction, we will be taxed. And the government has promised that this will be revenue neutral. That is, that it will replace other kinds of taxes and will not take more money from all of us than they're doing right now. Now, I don't believe this. I mean, one thing about a sales tax is that it's a silent tax. It can be placed so that you don't see it on the final product, so you don't really notice it all along the way. And I think perhaps in the first year it might be revenue neutral, just so that everybody doesn't get into arms. But once you have a sales tax like that in place, it is very, very easy for the government to generate income by rising by 1 percentage point each year. But also when you talk about revenue neutral, you have to think about revenue neutral for whom? Because it will not be revenue neutral for most people, because a sales tax is extremely regressive. What it means is that people who are in lower incomes are going to pay a larger proportion of their income on taxes than people who are richer. That's what happens when you have a sales tax. All of our notion of tax is that this really isn't fair. We like the notion of progressive taxes. That is, the notion that richer people can afford to pay a larger proportion of their income than poor people. But this is not what a sales tax is. And so you will find poor people paying more. So estimates are that this sales tax will generate about $14 billion a year, might be in the neighborhood of 12%, at least if the provinces come in on the deal or when they do. I think we won't see a sales tax in this budget. I think we will see, because they haven't worked it out with the provinces yet, but we will have a year on which to work against the sales tax. By the way, a sales tax will be very inflationary, and there will be a lot of inflationary pressures coming from this. We're also going to see tremendous calls for deficit reduction, and we've seen these things already. The strong calls from the business community now are for dramatic reduction in the government debt. They say if government does this, they will have more confidence and in the economy, and they will then do their duty and perform well. These business sectors are really a very unconfident group, and so we have to show to them and prove to them that indeed Canada can be really strong and really tough with regard to reducing social programs, basically. When business leaders talk about reducing the debt, they don't mean eliminating huge taxes and other special subsidies and concessions to business. They mean cuts in social services and public administration and increased taxes on the general population. When you see the Canadian Manufacturers Association in one brief to Wilson saying at the same time, you must reduce spending on social programs and you must give business tax breaks, that is precisely what I think we are going to be seeing. The government has certain political difficulties, of course, in cutting social programs. It's not popular. Canadians like the social programs we have. And we certainly saw what happened when there were attempts to cut unemployment insurance through the Forget Commission. This was not popular. Every group that appeared before it was against it. And also when they attempt to reduce old age, de-index the old age pension, there was a huge hue and cry. But they have been successful on some things. They did de-index the family allowance. They did de-index the child tax credit. People somehow forgot about that during election year. But this has been significant. By the way, those of you who get family allowance will recognize what this means. We got an increase of 36 cents per child per month this year. That was what it meant to people. So what is going to happen is that government is going to have to be extremely clever in their approach to reducing social programs. And what I think will happen is that whatever happens to social programs is that they will be redesigned and presented as progressive moves, but will actually involve cuts to the programs. And the best example of this and the way this works is what happened when they tried to introduce child care legislation. I think we're going to see a lot of attempts to renew a core income support program or a guaranteed annual income. And this is an odd position to be in, to be talking against this, because years ago I was very eager to see guaranteed annual income programs introduced. But when you see organizations like the Canadian Manufacturers Association, Conrad Black, calling for this, you realize that there are certain problems involved in a guaranteed annual income. The McDonald report had the best example of what it might mean. Essentially what the McDonald report said was, what you've got to do is to roll all the social programs into one program and then target it toward the very, very poor. So the whole point is that you will attack the issue of universality of social programs, not head on, but by a guaranteed annual income, which will be designed toward the very poor. So the McDonald Commission report suggested that we wrap up family allowance, old age pension, unemployment insurance, all kinds of social programs into one program, and then give a family of four, it was something like $7,500 a year, you would get an income of that. If you fell below $7,500 a year, you could have that topped up. Well, some people saw that this was going to be probably not enough for a family of four to live on, so there was some criticism of this. But essentially, the notion of a guaranteed annual income is very problematic when we think that every social program then will be designed not to serve people at large, but really we will be losing the notion of universality of delivery of social programs. And this is something we should not allow to have, even when it is presented to us using our own terms of things we've called for in the past. Unfortunately, we see this happening all the time, that things that we call for, we get, but in another form and another objective. And so this is once again I think, the kind of thing that is happening around the guaranteed annual income. But be careful of this, because some progressive groups are still, like the Canadian Council on Social Development, are still very wedded to this notion of a core income program. This will be very bad for certain groups of us, like women. Right now, universality has been very important to us, but you roll up unemployment insurance so that families are targeted, and what this means is essentially women don't get unemployment insurance. And this is the direction, and the government knows what this means, and I think we have to really worry about this. I didn't see when I started talking. I'm almost finished. The other things that we're going to see are issues around, these are no secrets. The government, of course, is going to accelerate privatization. They're going to sell off the furniture to pay the rent. That's essentially what we're going to be happening. So we won't have these, we won't have the things that have been important for developing poorer regions in the country, or for seeing that certain kinds of services take place in this country. So once again, privatization will be presented as an efficiency measure which will primarily improve services and be more efficient. But of course, what it will mean are fewer services available to the general public, and really a reduction of wages and working conditions of the people who are already servicing that industry. I think rural communities will be hit particularly hard by the increased privatization of the telephone. I think we're going to see this. Post office, two-tiered delivery of the healthcare system. These are the kinds of things that I think are likely to happen. Before I end, I did say that I would try not to be too pessimistic, but I do see work very, very much threatened in the future. That is, not thinking about future possibilities of work, what work might be. We had some suggestions earlier that we might be able to take time off, that there are enough people in this country to do the work that needs to be done, that some of us don't have to work very hard while other people don't get any money for working at all, that we may be able to combine notions of work, of people working in the home and providing services to people in a way with. All of these things are wonderful, but I think we're going to be spending the next 4 years at least fighting just to keep where we are. And we have a big, big job ahead of us. I think there's a hell of a lot that we can do. Many of us have worked really, really long and hard against free trade. And this is definitely going to harm us. We recognize how damaging it would be for us. Now, right now, I think we could be tempted to accept the role of the defeated. We really have lost something. We have lost a major fight. And for a short time after the election, I was extraordinarily pessimistic. I didn't realize what a really sore loser I was until that particular time. And I really do expect the Mulroney government to be very vindictive toward those groups who were against free trade. But I think it's extremely important for us to not let happen here what occurred in Britain and the United States when conservative forces became entrenched. We must not let the progressive forces in our country wither and become ineffectual. But I truly do not believe that this will happen in Canada. Something quite extraordinary happened in this campaign against free trade. We have built a national movement which does have a shared vision of a nation that we wanted to live in, which is very different from that of business and government. We did not have this shared vision when we began to come together in opposing free trade. We each knew our own issues and perhaps how free trade would affect us. I knew how free trade would affect women. But we did not have a sense of solidarity or a sense that all of the other groups would be interested in focusing on the effect it would have on our own particular group. But really, this changed over the course of 3 years. We all learned a great deal about each other and recognized that all of our issues were connected. Trade unions learned to recognize the significance of women's concerns. Women's groups began to talk more about how farmers are going to be affected by free trade. Cultural groups didn't confine their speeches just to and actions just to how it would affect their industry, but began by defining culture very, very widely, including what it meant, the culture of growing food. This was the first time, I mean, I see this whole fight against free trade as probably the closest we've come to class war in Canada. And this is the first time in the history of this nation that churches, environmental groups, peace groups, trade unions, farmers, women, the poor, immigrants, disabled, and cultural groups have worked together to develop a strong national presence. And this will not go away because we did not win on the issue of free trade. The networks have been developed, and I think that they will change the political future of this country. The political parties, in some respects, are not in control. I think these buildings of networks around this showed the political parties, and particularly the opposition parties, that only at their peril can they not listen to what people really want in Canada. We all know each other now. We know each other across this country, as big as it is, and we will continue to support each other in the future. Our opposition to Mulroney in the last 4 years focused on free trade, but I see this opposition coalescing more strongly on issues like privatization and deregulation and reduction of rural postal delivery and child care, and particularly on the sales tax. But in short, I see it coalescing around the whole agenda of the right. The next 4 years will be extremely difficult years. We will have to fight hard, really, just to keep what we have. We need to continue to work in our communities and doing the kinds of things that we have been very, very good at doing. For those 3 years before the election, community groups informed each other. They told each other, they learned together about what free trade would mean for them. We don't have $40 million to spend the last 2 weeks of the election, but what we do have are lots of people that can deliver these messages over a long period of time, and we have to continue to doing that. And we have to continue to work in solidarity with other groups across the country. I think an immediate struggle around the sales tax could be extremely effective. This kind of tax is extremely unpopular, and we have to stop it. It will be very, very damaging to poor people and near poor people in this country. It is extremely regressive and very bad. And we'd only have to remember that, it was only a small tax on gasoline which got rid of Joe Clark early on. And so you think of a massive tax on everything, we may be able to do it. So people need to continually remind this government that the majority of people in Canada were not behind them, that our future is a political issue, and the people of this country can determine the design of the future. But we can only do it collectively. We may not be able to convince the government to do the right thing by the use of rational argument, but one thing we can do is convince other people in this country through rational argument what is right. The Tory agenda for furthering its ideological objectives are very clear. They want to end universality, they want tax cuts for business rather than job creation, they want restricted access to unemployment insurance compensation, they want to privatize everything in sight, they want to rearm the nation, they want to maintain the inequalities that already exist. There has been a pretense of consultation in the last 4 years with the government, with various kinds of groups, to reach some kind of social consensus. So the government has met with women's groups, labor leaders, and social welfare groups. They've all been dutifully listened to. That is, they've consulted widely, listened very, very narrowly. It's a real sham, and it's a pure political exercise to deflect frustration of groups. It's going to take a whole lot more from us than talking to the government to make a difference now. The problem of unemployment and of social inequality is not going to be solved by leaving business and the market alone. This has been tried and it hasn't worked. Canada needs a very comprehensive plan which integrates the various sectors of the economy and various regions of the country. And it will not happen by chance. But most important, we need to assert that the choices which have been made are not rational choices for us. Economic decisions have been made which are not in our interests. And I think we have to keep asking the question, for whom and for what does Canada stand on guard? And I think right now it doesn't look like it's for the people of Canada. But the future cannot be abandoned to greedy, self-interested exploitation of a few hundred massive international corporations. We have to make the future ours, and I think we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen. We look forward to hearing from you again tomorrow morning. Many years ago, when I was working for a lawyer, he told me that there's a word in German that expresses the emotion you feel when a rival falls on his face. I don't remember what the word was, but last night when I was driving home, I thought, we need a word to express the feeling that you have when you listen to someone like Dr. Marjorie Cohen speaking with authority and conviction and confirming all of your worst fears. It isn't exactly pleasure, some combination of grim satisfaction. I suspect we'll have more of the same this morning. And while it was, in many instances, appalling, the information, it was also a marvelous speech. And I would like once again to introduce to you Dr. Marjorie Cohen.
I feel like I haven't left. I'm here this morning to talk about the W word, that is women. I have noticed recently, in the past year or so, that it's become quite unfashionable to focus on women the way we used to be able to do people who were progressive politically a few years ago. And there is a sense that this W word is being rubbed out of the language. The buzzword now is families. And even very progressive groups are being sucked into using the word family and focusing on families in the way that we used to do on women. So we now see family violence replacing violence against women. And we see that feminization of poverty receives a lot less attention than poor families. And that social benefits for women are really simply ignored. We now focus on helping families adjust. And I think this is because it's a lot easier to talk about these issues and progressive measures in terms of families than in terms of women. Even feminists feel a whole lot more comfortable with pushing demands in the name of the family than in the demands in the name of women themselves. We're here today to talk about the future of work and what's going to be happening to women's work. And I think what we all recognize is that although often work appears to be structured in a sort of asocial way, in fact, every society makes decisions. I mean, whether they're conscious or unconscious, every society collectively makes decisions about the division of labor. And every society that we know of, work has been primarily divided according to sex. And ours certainly has been absolutely no exception to this. Of course, there have been great changes over time, and I think it's, most of us are very thankful to be living now than 20 years ago or 50 years ago, most of us as women. That is, it's easier. Our work is somehow, we feel we have more control over our work and our lives and our destination. Certainly in the 19th century, women's work was totally subsumed under male work. Men owned everything, and they controlled everything, even within the household. The women had very, very little ability to have control over their own work. Even the sort of primary products of their labor, their children, were officially owned by the males. But we have seen an enormous amount of change, and this change has been a result of both conscious political action and changes in the structures of the economy. And for a few minutes, I'd really like to talk about what the nature of change has been. By the way, when I talk about women's work, now we're very used to saying that women's work isn't confined simply to when they go out into the labor force and are paid, but really is very, very diverse and takes into all other kinds of actions that many other people are paid for. Women tend not to be paid for. But what I want to focus on is what has happened around the ability of women to get paid for their work in the past 20 years. So the changes really, even in the past 10 years, have been extremely dramatic and much more so than most people recognize. Let's look for a minute just at the notion of family and what is happening to the family and how rapidly this is changing. Now, we do have an idea that the traditional family, that is where you have one income earner who is male and one housekeeper and child care worker who is female, this kind of traditional family is really very much in decline. But this decline is occurring at an incredibly rapid rate, and I think it hasn't been recognized in public policy decision-making. In 1971, 65% of all Canadian families had this traditional structure with the male and the father outside working and women and the mother inside the home primarily. By the 1981 census, this has absolutely changed remarkably. That is 65% in 71. By 81, this had dropped to be only 16% of all Canadian families. That was within a 10-year period. And what we found happening at the same time is that the lone parent families rose by about 60%. So over that 10-year period, you had the number of single-parent families just about the same as the number of traditional kinds of families. So we had a very, very rapid change in the kind of structure of how families earned their income and took care of the work in the family. Now, interesting things are happening around women's paid work as well. We're used to the fact that more and more women are entering the labor force. But what is happening is that women are no longer withdrawing from the labor force when they have children the way they used to. We used to think and teach and talk about women's marginal attachment to the labor force. We were used to the idea that they would drop out during childbearing years and go back to work when they were older and where their children were in school. But this is not happening now. The majority of women who are in their highest are in the period of time where they are most likely to bear children, that is between 24 and 34. The vast majority of these women are in the labor force. Almost 75% of them are in the labor force in that age period. 58% of women with preschool children work, and just about the same proportion of women with children under 3 are working for pay. Now, so we have, almost 60% of the women in this country with children who are not in school are working for pay. 10 years earlier, this was only 32%. So we've seen a very, very rapid change here in a very, very short period of time. So the point is that we have an unprecedented number of younger married women with small children working. Now, this is often presented as a choice which women have made. That is, they prefer to work outside the home and stay home with their kids. But there really have been very, very compelling circumstances which have forced women to take on this kind of double duty of working in the home and working outside the home. And the most obvious, of course, is that families can't cope with one income. And this becomes a very compelling reason why women begin to work. So, as I mentioned last night, that in the 4 years from 1984 to 88, that is coincidentally during the Mulroney period of his first tenure in office, we had a substantial drop in individual real income. So while the average earnings have increased over a 4-year period by 11.7%, prices have risen by 17.3%. So what this means is that we had a drop in real incomes of 5.6% in a 4-year period of time. So people are able to buy much less with their income than they used to be able to. And also what we've seen is there's been quite a sharp increase in the gap between the lowest and the highest paid workers. So for example, in that 4-year period, while hourly wages increased by 8%, managers' incomes increased by 23%, senior executive incomes increased by 24%, and top executives' incomes increased by 44%. So what we find is also that there has been a widening of the gap between the incomes of people in different regions of the country during this period of time as well. So what we have found is that workers in Ontario and Quebec have had much larger wage increases than workers in other parts of the country. And workers in Western provinces have fared worse, and their increases are substantially below the national average. Now, the fact that there are more women working for wages than ever before does not mean necessarily that our position in the labor force is improving. Actually, what's happening is that men's wages are increasing faster than women's, and the progress toward narrowing the gap between male and female wages has been slowed rather dramatically. In 1971, the gap between male and female wage was about $3,500 a year. By 1985, this gap had increased to over $10,000 a year. These are in actual terms. And I think this probably reflects what is happening to women's jobs, women's paid work in Canada. Certainly, there have been more jobs created for women. Women are continuing to enter the labor force in larger proportions. And in fact, this has been one of the great boasts of the Conservative government, and that this substantiates their claim that they have worked hard on behalf of women. So in the past 10 years, we've had 1.5 million jobs created for women. But while full-time employment during this period has risen by 33%, part-time employment has increased by 74%. So we find that the ability of women to get jobs is actually taking place more and more in the more marginal areas of employment. And the vast majority of the jobs which have been created for women have been low-paying with little or frequently no employee benefits and little job security. So women are often seen as attractive workers because we fulfill the need for a flexible labor force. Now, flexibility in the labor force is actually a euphemism for getting people to work at less than the desirable wage rates and really at poor working conditions. So the more traditional kinds of jobs where workers have been able to organize in unions have been in the manufacturing sector, and these are precisely the areas in our economy which are not expanding. So actually what has happened is in the past, the proportion of women working in manufacturing has actually dropped in the past decade. Actually, even the actual numbers of women working in manufacturing have dropped. So most women, as you probably are familiar with by now, work in 5 occupational categories. That is, 75% of us work in 5 occupational groups: clerical work, sales, service, teaching, and healthcare. Clerical work still remains the largest single occupational area for women, with about 30% of the female labor force working there. But this is one area, a traditional area, which is also declining rather rapidly. Just 3 years ago, we had about a third, or 34% of female workers in clerical occupations. But what is happening is that we are seeing a fall off in employment in this area, primarily because a greater proportion of our data processing can take place outside the country now as a result of changes in technology and changes in things like the free trade agreement. So women's jobs are overwhelmingly referred to as the service sector of the economy. And this includes just about everything which is in agriculture, resource extraction, manufacturing, and construction. And so we are really dominant in this area. In fact, 84% of women in this country work in the service sector. And unfortunately, there are a great range of jobs in the service sector, from very high-paid executive jobs to very, very lowly paid domestic cleaning. But the bulk of jobs which are being created for women are low-level, poorly paid, temporary, and part-time. And this is what is happening now. I didn't plan to talk about the effect of free trade, and I was speaking to someone last night who said, he said, I guess the whole point is anytime you talk about women's work now, you have to talk about free trade, and somehow or other I had kind of put that behind me. But it is true that whatever is going to be happening to us in the future will be very, very much affected by the free trade deal. I was very active in the anti-free trade movement, really trying to explain what the effect would be on women. And initially, when I started working on free trade back in 1984, it appeared that I was working with immigrant groups in Toronto, skills and language training for immigrant women in the Toronto area. And what occurred to me in that election, which was when free trade was first mentioned, was that the people who would get hit first and hardest would be people who were most vulnerable, like immigrants, women of color, people who were really going to, who always have a hard time whenever we have an economic downturn, when anything goes wrong. And so I looked more carefully at the industries where immigrant women were concentrated and discovered, yes, indeed, these are in the industries that the government likes to refer to as sunset industries. You know, it's this idea that, we're never going to see them again. And as though these industries do not deserve to survive. So these women were highly concentrated in textiles and clothing, and in food processing. So the government has this notion that we can somehow phase out textiles and clothing. Most people do not realize that textiles and clothing is the single largest manufacturing industry in Canada in terms of the number of people it employs and in terms of the proportion of the national income it generates. That industry alone generates 7% of the entire national income. If you wipe out an industry like this, or say we don't really need to sustain that industry, you will have a depression. If you have a drop of 7% in your national income, you have a depression. And this is serious stuff. But you know, when we first, even those of us who are against free trade, when we first started talking about it, do you remember what we focused on? Auto industry, breweries, resource sector, not areas where women worked. And so I made a real conscious effort to have us look at the manufacturing sector, particularly food processing, where women are highly concentrated, chemicals, electronic products, and of course textiles and clothing. And it was very clear that these were indeed the most vulnerable industries under free trade. I think often what happens with regard to economic change in our country does not get looked at, the areas where we see most dramatic change, precisely because women work there. It isn't seen as important. Anyway, after looking at the manufacturing sector, of course, we don't have many women working in manufacturing. Only 12% of all women in the labor force are in the manufacturing sector. Most of us work in the service sector of the economy. And no one had looked at the service sector. In spite of the fact that this accounts for 2/3 of our national income, 70% of the people in this country who are working work in the service sector. The McDonald Commission report, which was the major report to convince Canadians that we should have free trade, did 72 background studies in addition to that 1,000-page volume that they put out, but 72 background studies on various facets of the economy. Not one was on a service industry in this country, not one. And yet we entered a free trade, the very first free trade agreement to include services in the world. We entered into that free trade agreement with absolutely no notion of what the impact would be on the service sector. And there still has been very, very little work done on it. There's some concern about the impact on financial services, but even that was entered into. So what we have now is essentially a free trade agreement which specifically names 299 service industries which are included in the agreement. And this is everything from agricultural services to health care services. It includes things like management of all hospitals, ambulance services, almost anything we can think of. So this will have an impact on women, whether we're working in the home or whether we're working in the labor force. It'll have an impact on all Canadians because it will mean we will have a different form of delivery of certain kinds of social services, but it also means that the people who are doing this kind of work will be doing it under different kinds of conditions. So a great deal of what we can anticipate in the future will be in reaction to the free trade agreement. I think we will see a fairly significant restructuring of the female labor force in terms of the kind of work we are able to do as a result of the free trade agreement. When I started talking today, I said that this has to do, what happens with regard to change over time has to do with both political action and what women have been able to do to assert their rights and their demands around labor, but it also has to do with structural changes in the economy, because the way the economy is structured certainly does affect the future of our work. And I want to talk about women's role in decision-making, particularly around different kinds of issues than women have traditionally dealt with. by now governments and employees are used to women's interventions and issues like maternity leave, child care, even equal pay, health and safety issues, working conditions, those sorts of issues. And they're quite prepared to hear us speak when we talk about reproductive choice or pornography, anything which can be seen as a women's issue per se. But what is happening more and more is that women realize that we have to have a greater say in economic decision making. And it isn't enough to say that we are exercising our decision-making power when we decide to take a job outside the home. We have to be in power in order to help shape the choices we're given. Now, all of the issues which we as women have fought for are ultimately connected to the way the entire society is run. Women collectively are beginning to make these connections and to realize that economic decision-making by government and business affects just how successful we can be in every single area of our lives. So we can fight for years and years for something like equal pay for work of equal value. And ultimately, we may be able to get some gains in this area. Most provinces now have at least equal pay laws of some sort or another. But winning here is a really small victory. I know you don't have equal pay for work of equal value. We don't either in Ontario. But winning this sort of thing is a very small victory if government economic policy essentially means there are going to be fewer jobs altogether. Essentially having the ability to claim equal pay doesn't help much if you don't have a job. So when women begin to talk about economic issues like the budget, trade policy, tax structures, privatization, deregulation, the government really thinks we're going too far. It is preferable for them to have us deal with women's issues, what they can confine us to in terms of women issues. And we really need to know our place. I want to give you one example of this that happened to me. During the election, Simon Reisman wrote an op-ed article for the Globe and Mail, and what he was complaining about was essentially that people were able to claim attention on the anti-free trade side, and he referred to every Tom, Dick, and Marjorie, regardless of credentials, who was able to have their views put forward. And of course, what had happened, I wasn't the only Marjorie. There was Marjorie Bowker, the judge, who really gave him a great deal of grief, and there was also Marjorie Nicholson, who is a columnist for the Ottawa Citizen. So anyway, that's obviously a popular name for anti-free trade forces and for women. But from the perspective of government and business, women and economics don't mix well because essentially everything we demand are seen as takeaways, not contributions. So our insistence on things like full employment, true equality, universal pensions, better social services, these are considered unrealistic in the hard world of economics. And it isn't that our demands are seen as totally unreasonable. You know, in the best of all possible worlds, the governments all want to do this, but they don't fit in with hard time economics. So what we have to say about economics is treated as a discussion of welfare policy, not economic policy. Now, this is, of course, a very serious mistake, because when women always have been and always will be part of our economy, and any kind of economic strategy which does not take into account women's labor, women's contribution, women's potential is really not going to be very successful. But when women talk about economics, it makes governments very nervous, because what we tend to focus on is the irrationality of the way they're doing things. We focus on goals and objectives and are very critical of the choices which have been made and the choices which have been damaging for people. So, we see never before in the history of human existence has there been as much food produced in the world as there is now. And yet people starve to death in some parts of the world, and even some parts of this country, while vast quantities of food rot in storehouses in North America and in Europe. So women see this as irrational, doesn't make sense. We know that in Canada there is considerable poverty, and that this poverty is growing, in spite of the fact that we are a rich nation and we have absolutely magnificent resources. We know that there's a need for better social services and and people to provide for them. We know that our children are not being well cared for. We know that a lot of people are sick and old who are not getting the proper care. Our unemployment rate is huge. There are enough people to do this. We see this waste of labor as extremely irrational. And of course, women are downright hostile to government programs which are directed towards supporting war industry, towards spending millions on Arctic submarines rather than spending money to meet real human needs. So we're critical of the priorities which have been established and feel that governments and their supporters in industry have lost sight of the goals of what we need to do in society to have a more just and a more equitable society. So the task for women, I think now, when we're thinking of work, is to look at the structure of our economy and our society and to develop critical approaches to a whole host of economic issues so that we really can become much more effective in changing things. Now, I want to emphasize that I certainly do believe that women have been analytical on focusing on the goals of the society. But what we need now is to be able to fight with specifics and with the, and fight with these specifics with the people who are in power who have goals which are different from our own. So what we need to do is to convince our own people who are likely to be sympathetic with us, that the action against wrong-headed government policies is possible and doable. And we need to do this from a position of a strength of knowledge. Now, I think to most women, it seems to be an overwhelming task to try to deal with vast economic structures and talking, debating horrible people like John Crispo or Simon Reisman or Tom DeCino. But really it isn't. Some really excellent economic analysis has been generated by women who were not considered experts. Actually, I think one of the most positive results of the feminist movement in the past 20 years has been growing confidence in challenging experts on any particular subject. That is, we've rejected the idea that only people with the proper credentials, the experts, are necessarily right on any given issue. So in the area of healthcare, we've challenged doctors' notions of what's good for women. In the area of childcare, we challenge their notion of what we are told makes us good mothers. And even though women have not been nuclear physicists, they have been able to challenge the advisors who tell us that the proliferation of nuclear energy is not going to be dangerous to the health of people in this world. And we do this because what we recognize is that what we're being sold as the truth based on scientific information does not relate to our lives and our world. That often the advice of experts serves specific interest of people in power which are not our interest. So we've rejected credentialism and the belief that you can't talk about something that unless you have a piece of paper that says you can. And so women have rejected this. So it's important for women to remember that not everyone starts out knowing everything, even the experts. But we can become knowledgeable and expert in our own areas, in the things that we know about, that we deal with in our day-to-day lives. So I think that this is what is most important for women in the women's movement now, is to recognize that how all of the things we have worked for, whether it's reproductive rights, whether it's on issues of violence, whatever it is connected with, is ultimately connected to the structure of our society. And unless we can change that structure, unless we can have more control and more power over determining what our choices are going to be, over determining the way our future is going to be, we really will not be able to make headway in any area. So it becomes very important what we do now. The important point is, where do we go from here? I know that this will be discussed a great deal in this conference. Obviously, the next speaker is going to be speaking about very important issues like employment equity. Getting a job becomes very, very important. We are going to hear about, in this conference, about how communities do not have to wait until the whole economy has changed and the structure is okay in order to be able to fight for their own sustainable future. So we can do things on a local level, but we also need to work on changing larger structures, because often we can go far in one area and be absolutely slaughtered when it comes to people who are in power at another level. I think the women's movement is in for a rough time in the next 4 years. I think that the Mulroney government will be very vindictive toward those groups who were most vocal against free trade, And I feel very responsible for my own organization in this area, and I'm quite worried about it. I do think there's going to be a wholehearted attack against the National Action Committee on the Status of Women. You may know that we are largely government funded under the assumption that this is one of the, since women are so underrepresented in all forms of power, that the least the government can do is to fund some bodies that speak on behalf of women at the national level. But I really do anticipate rather soon that this funding will be eliminated. And this means that there will not be a concerted national voice in that sense for women in this country. So I think we need to maintain solidarity among women's groups. I am very pleased that actually there has been such a marvelous turnout at the Pro-Canada Network meetings which have occurred after the election period. In fact, there have been greater representation from across the country than there was even before the election. I think there's a real sense of vulnerability of groups, particularly groups like anti-poverty groups, Native groups, women's groups, who have relied a great deal on government funding. And there's a sense that we need to band together against attacks by government. Now, obviously, in the next few years, what we will have to do is really to understand what the effects of free trade are going to be on women, to monitor it very, very closely. This is not going to be easy because many of the places where women lose their jobs are ununionized, and we simply do not know. Therefore, what proportion of that labor force has been male or female? It's very, very difficult information to get. Also, the more subtle ways that we are going to be affected, whether it's through harmonization of pesticide standards or harmonization of any kind of standard, consumer standards. What these effects are going to take a lot of work by a lot of people to understand. But I think that we do have to keep fighting the issue of free trade. It isn't over, and it won't be over because it's going to continue to affect us for a long time to come. But we also have to broaden our perspective to include the whole agenda of the right. There is nothing that they can propose which will be good for us. And so we are going to be there saying, don't do it for the next 4 years at least. But we have to make sure that it isn't longer than that.
Yeah, that's fine. You did perfectly. Hello. We will now open the floor for questions. We have about 15 minutes before the next speaker. Klaus needed his whole 45 minutes to...
Thank you, Bonnie. I was talking to someone at break this morning, and they said, this isn't a large conference. There's not a lot of people, but there's good people here. And I think that's the most important thing sometimes. I'm really happy to see all these good people here. And I'm hoping that we can get a lot done this afternoon in our individual workshops. We're extremely pleased that Marjorie Cohen could come all the way from Toronto, and we're doubly pleased that she'll be at Simon Fraser University next year. Is the resident head of the Women's Studies program. We were very stimulated by Marjorie last night and this morning. We found her extremely eloquent and erudite and very charming as well. And if Marjorie would like to come forward now, I'd like to give you a little gift because I know you have to fly back this afternoon. And we're just so happy you could come. This is a genuine hand-carved Doukhobor wooden spoon. It took 4 years to create, and there's a little note inside about it as to the details in the carver.
Yes. Okay, you get to go to lunch now.
I've left some propaganda on the desk there if you want to pick it up.
Here and here.
Moderate income women?
Oh, this is an absolute disaster. Tax reform, it's another one of those things that we all used to call for, and then when you get it, it's an absolute disaster. So the Tories have given tax reform a bad name. Obviously, what is going to happen is that low-income people are going to be terribly hurt by this. Now, the government, by the notion of a sales tax, a very, very broad sales tax on virtually everything, what the government has promised is that the real poor, the desperately poor, will have tax credits, which they can receive at the end of the year when they file their income tax, which will in fact mean that there will have been no effect from the sales tax. But you really have to be very, very, very poor to take advantage of this. So what it means for most people in this country is that there will be a greater proportion of their income will be paid in taxes. So women will be particularly hard hit since we are disproportionate among the poor and the near poor and the low income workers. We will be paying a larger proportion of our income in taxes than men will.
Is that the income tax as well as the sales tax?
No, this is as a result of sales tax, but if we take the whole broad tax base, that's essentially what it will mean, is that women will be paying a larger proportion. So I think this is a really important rallying point for women, actually for all people, because it's a very, very dangerous move. It's a very, very regressive step in taxation, and we cannot allow this to happen. I don't think that the specifics for the sales tax reform will be in this budget because Wilson hasn't been able to work out an agreement with the provinces. So I think we have a year to mount a huge national campaign against this. And I think it's one way to keep people who have been so discouraged because of what happened around free trade together and active. And it is something that I think we really could make a difference on this particular issue and say, we don't want that. In many cases, for those of us who are activists, it's always hard to keep saying, no, we don't want, rather than this is what we want and work for something progressive. But there are times in your political life when you know you don't want to call for anything because you would get such a perversion of it with a government like this that it would be a disaster. And really, you don't want to call, even attempt for something progressive. I hope that the whole child care issue dies, for example, that nothing happens to it, because what we have is better than what they propose. And you don't want to even call them to redesign it, because they will not do it in our interest. Anything they are doing is not in our interest, and we have to always keep that in mind. So don't ask them to do anything, just prevent them from doing what they want to do.
Ontario does have some pay equity or equal pay for reform legislation, and I'm curious to have your response on it, because certainly that's another area where people are beginning to say, don't ask for legislation because it's going to be so bad you don't want it. Now, where are you on that in Ontario?
Yes, I mean, I've been very active in calling for equal pay for work of equal value for years and years and years. This is not what we have by a long, long stretch. I think it's really poor. I think it's going to be very, very damaging for any kind of collective bargaining in the province. I think it's going to be really problematic around that. I think it is not going to change wage differentials between males and females. They've done a very odd thing. There is a notion that we all have that it's fair if you have a man and a woman who are sitting next to each other doing work all day long, and they're doing the work that has the same value. That is, she has the same kind of qualification, she brings in just as much money to the firm, her work is the same value as that man. You should be able to have a law that says they have to be paid the same. That was our notion of equal pay for work of equal value. What we got is the notion that women, because we are in job ghettos, have lower pay wages than men. So what we have in Ontario is that only women who are in occupations which have 60% female can compare to occupations which have 70% male. So it becomes extremely limited what kinds of jobs you can compare with each other. And then not only that, this doesn't work on an individual basis, it works on a group basis. And what you get paid then is the average of that male 70%, not that guy sitting next to you and saying, I should get as much as he does, not that, but the average of what all these people earn. And it's a very, very complicated system which has put into place, which means that employers who use it, or employers who will qualify under the law, have to have job evaluation schemes in place. Now the problem with these which will determine pay rates between groups. The problem with the job evaluation schemes is that they're done by human beings who already have prejudice about the value of women's work. So they are very, very biased as they are. So altogether, I do not feel that this is a giant leap for womankind. It's very, very problematic. I'd be really careful with it. And you know, once again, it's one of the things that government's willing to do and to look progressive. Certain governments are willing to do that, but when it comes to the crunch, they're not doing it because it's in our interest. And in Ontario, they reacted a great deal to the pressure from the business community. So millions and millions and millions will be spent on this, but the people who will get the money are going to be the consultants make a lot of money to the consultants, to the firms who are going to be. These consultants are going to be experts in employment, in pay equity. They're going to be able to tell firms how to get around the most obvious impact of the legislation, and they're the people going to get the real money. There's a marvelous book that comes out of here, out of BC, which is called "Just Give Us the Money," and I like that. I like the title of it.
You mentioned briefly the taking power, or us as individuals having power. I see that as being important, but I don't really see how to go about it. You also mentioned last night that in terms of power, the real power wasn't with governments at all, but with these large economic units. I wonder if you could broaden your statements on how we as individuals take power and have meaningful impact on what is done.
You know, I think that one thing that happened during the whole free trade issue and debate was that people had a sense that they could be powerful. I mean, when you think of how wildly efficient we were in what we were able to do compared with the government who spent billions and billions of dollars in big business, we didn't have that kind of money to spend. And yet we were able to scare them. We really scared them. We also scared the two opposition political parties, who for the first time had to recognize that they had to listen to people, that they could claim to be people's parties, but if they didn't hear what people were saying, they were going to get into a lot of trouble. And I think we have that kind of power. I think we've learned that. We have to continue to make it develop and make it grow. Now, clearly, any collective group of people as diverse as Canadians are going to have a lot of trouble around solidarity. Marjorie was very successful with this in the last election. You can convince everybody that Ontario was a problem. If anything was going to be bad for Ontario, it was going to be good for the rest of the country. And you know, this can be done. But essentially, when you go from community to community, I find really like-mindedness around the way we want to live. And we don't have a vision of the future which is the same and is congruent with that of Business Council and National Issue or the large multinational corporations. But how a nation does that is a tough, long haul, I think. I mean, clearly you have to have the real power coming from a large, large body of people. And you have to have political parties which can respond to it. I mean, part of our problem in the last elections, we had to rely on the Liberals and the NDP. And that was a big disappointment for us because they didn't come through on what we needed. The Liberals were constantly stabbing their leader in the back, and so there was no way he could be succeeded. The NDP didn't want to deal with free trade because they thought the Liberals had already run away with it, so we couldn't convince them to take the issue. And yet that's where the people were. We have to somehow make those parties, whatever we happen to be involved with each of ourselves, know that they have to respond to people, that it isn't theirs because they're the professionals in the party, that if they're speaking for people, they have to listen to them. And that's what we have to do. So there are lots of ways that we can do this. The other way is with regard to the media. I think, our biggest problems in the election are the two political parties, the problem in Quebec, in which free trade was seen as a nationalist issue and therefore something Quebecers should be against, and the fact that big business had a hell of a lot of money to spend. They were able to spend in the last 2 weeks of the election more money than the Liberals spent in the entire campaign. I mean, that's just in the last 2 weeks that the business community spent in advertisements, and you're up against a lot when you're dealing with that. And then the other thing was the media. And almost universally in this country, the media was against the anti-free trade forces. And we have to find political ways of dealing with these things so we don't lose next time around. I think we can deal with the media. Launch formal complaints, see what they're doing. Do not let them have business have the last word every single time. During the free trade agreement, the debates on these things, every time the anti-free trade group had a news conference, the news report was balanced. We had Tom DeKino of the Business Council National Issue, or Richard Lipsey, or somebody else responding to what we had said. They got the last word. Every time they had a news conference, that's it. That's balanced reporting just in itself. And we have to continually to resist the notion that whatever you see as the truth in the newspaper is somehow balanced if it doesn't include the position of labor. I mean, why have a report on business? Why not a report on labor in the big national newspaper? We don't even have a labor reporter any longer in the Globe and Mail. And this is absolutely extraordinary. You know, so we should demand this. That isn't good enough simply to have you know, one perspective put forward. But what I want to say is that as a nation, it is possible to have things occur in the interest of people of nations. Other nations have managed to do it. Now, they're nations with different kinds of histories than ours, and I don't mean for a minute that we can follow their pattern. But other nations have been able to look out after their own self-interest, and they do. Canada is not. We are not prepared to do it, or at least this government is not prepared to do it. So I think it is possible to see that our representatives, our political parties, listen to us. And I think one way we have to do this is having more women in our political parties, too. More the right kind of women, anyway, not Pat Carney.
You said last night at the Wine and Cheese that a lot of I work with clerical workers, and I want to be able to go back and answer their question when they say, I think our jobs are disappearing. And you had said that with the free trade agreement, some of the clerical work would be moving to places like Jamaica, with American Express being able to ship their work there. So I just can't quite make that link. I mean, do they actually take boxes of American Express slips and send them down to Jamaica and fax them down to whatever, and that's what they're doing, and that's more efficient to do that, to send all of that work there to be data processed? I can't quite make that direct link.
Oh, you mean how it's physically done?
How it's physically done. I just wonder if they're going to ask me that question, and I couldn't answer it.
What has happened, we were discussing this last night, and what is amazing is that this free trade agreement is really going to facilitate transborder, what they refer to as transborder data flows. And we don't have many protections on this now, actually, but we do have a few. And one is in the Bank Act, and this is a very important one, is that the Bank Act in Canada says that all kinds of data, banking data, has to be processed and stored in Canada. And the reasons for this are reasons of security, privacy, and so on. Not reasons around labor, but it incidentally, of course, means that we have people employed in Canada doing this work. Now, the banks have been very unhappy about this because they do know that if they can have this stuff processed in other parts, in low-wage countries, that it can be much cheaper if it's a vast volume of data. But our Bank Act still says that the banks this data has to be processed and stored in Canada. Although American reports on the free trade agreement, American government reports on the free trade agreement say very specifically, we have a way around this. We've negotiated with the Canadians a way around this. So we know that this is not going to last very long. But when American Express was given bank status in the Ordering Council by Cabinet, they, at the same time, were given the ability to process and store data anywhere they wanted to. So they don't have to do it in Canada. This is the inroads, changes by American Express. This is going to have a big repercussion on clerical work in Canada. And we don't often think of free trade as affecting something like clerical work. It seems like such a local thing. Now, to get back to your question, I wish I knew the actual physical mechanics of how this happens, whether or not large amounts of the actual stubs are sent. I have a feeling that they are, and that it's processed in that way. But I don't know very specifically how this happens. But there is a tremendous amount of data processing which is now occurring outside of the country. We've lost an enormous amount of jobs as a result of this. There's a very interesting organization, I've forgotten the name of it. Anyway, it is located in Winnipeg, but they deal with Canadian Independent Computer Association, who have calculated the number of lost jobs through, just routine kind of clerical work being processed outside of this country.
I'm from the trade union movement, so right now, the BC Fed a couple of weeks ago had a conference on pay equity, and I wasn't able to attend that. But I know that trade equity is going to be an important issue in future contract negotiations that are going on from both within, well, the trade unions that do represent clerical and service industry workers. And I'd just like you to address a little bit about the impact that that will have on, rather than from the government. A lot of issues, a lot of social service issues have been brought through from the trade union movement and have been a very positive impact. The second thing I'd like to sort of, I'm in the telecommunications industry, and how a lot of that data is transferred. It's done on data tape. When you go in and purchase something like with MasterCard or Visa, they run it through a card. It's immediately off your account. The tapes are, in many cases, sent offshore, or they're sent to right-to-work states in the United States where they are processed and very low wages, and it isn't hard to transfer that information, and they don't use paper. They don't have to send the actual stubs.
Thank you.
That's the further information, but on the...
Yeah. What is... I mean, it's very important that progressive things occur through collective bargaining, and there have been really important gains made in some areas for women in this. But I mean, one of the major, it does depend, of course, on the strength of the union. I mean, in some areas, this is never going to be good enough because the unions in these areas haven't been strong enough, and that we would like to see decent kind of legislation. But one of the biggest problems have been for women around pay has been that there tend to be across-the-board percentage increases whenever there are wage increases. That is, we don't do the kind of thing that they did in Sweden, which was to say, which was negotiated essentially between the government, business, and labor, which was what we're going to do. Our objective is to raise the lowest wage workers. So women weren't targeted, but they said we're going to raise the wages of the lowest wage workers. So you had the lowest wage workers having a higher percentage increase for a long period of time over high wage workers. You know what happened? In a very, very short period of time, 3 or 4 years, you had the wage gap between males and women dropping, so that their wage gap is now like 86. Women make 86% of what men earn. So, I mean, that was a very, very dramatic way to have it happen. Now, I've been a part of a union which tried to negotiate this. This is a very rare union that will, by the way. Most unions won't. And I was part of one that tried it, and of course the employer resisted it like crazy. I mean, they just weren't going to allow this to happen. So often, even if you have goodwill on the part of the union to do it, it becomes a tough thing to do nationally. Now, unfortunately, with our pay equity legislation in Ontario, because you have to compare the average of women's groups with the average of men's groups in certain valued labor situations, what we are seeing now in the first year of pay equity, and this is a union strategy, and it just sends me chills, is that what they're doing in the first year of pay equity are negotiating higher wages for men under the assumption that the pay equity legislation is going to force the women's up to that. And that's that's the result of now this is happening with CUPE in Ontario. Right now, and they're consciously negotiating that. So sometimes when you get sometimes when you get this kind of legislation, it becomes very distorting over tactics. So it's, that's very bothersome. It makes sense. It really does if you think that, okay, you've got 4 more years to catch up, you have 5 years to do it, so what we'll do is, peg men's wages high so that the women's wages will have to be equal, but it leads to very distorting kinds of actions, which politically can be very troublesome. So I have a lot. I think it's very important that women's issues around maternity leave and safety, health and safety, and equal pay, and so on, be negotiated. I think that this is often the best way in order to achieve this. But in a lot of cases, this becomes very difficult if employers are extremely strong, and the one thing that they're going to resist is having women getting equal wages. It's never in the interest of the employer for women to be paid the same. Never.
Okay, one last question.
Okay. I just wanted to ask if you saw any significance in the growth of women and their ownership of small businesses. That
yes.
It's on the rise, sort of they don't find the flexibility in the existing
yes.
labor situation. So
this is a very interesting question. I'm glad you raised it because it's very important, because it is something that gives us the sense that we can be in control, that we don't have to be under somebody else's thumb, that we can run our our own lives and our own business. In fact, there is an attempt by the government to promote small business everywhere. We know that the largest, I know in Toronto, 1 in 2 employees in a business have accounted for the largest job growth over the past certain number of years, and much, much larger than firms with over 500 employees. So it seems to be good for the economy, it seems to be good for the individual. The government is really, really pushing, and this government has really pushed women as entrepreneurs. And it does sound, it does sound good. However, and there are times when it really is good for individual women. But when you look at the overall statistics, it doesn't turn out that way. What you see happening is that the average female entrepreneur in Canada, by the way, the government pushes it in this way. Excuse me for interrupting myself, but what they say is, women-run businesses, they are growing faster than male-run businesses, women as entrepreneurs. Women businesses do not fail as rapidly as male-run businesses, and women will stick with it longer. Okay. What this shows in certain sense is our masochism, because what you see is that female entrepreneurs actually don't do very well. The average female entrepreneur in Canada earns, her income is about $6,000 less than the average female worker's wage, including full and part-time work in Canada. What this often means when we refer to the female entrepreneur is, in fact, a tremendous amount of self-exploitation. And we have to be very, very careful about this. This doesn't mean that women shouldn't try to do things that they're good at and that they shouldn't try to pursue a way of making a living, given the circumstances that they find themselves in. I mean, we have to encourage that and we have to allow that to happen. But we mustn't have women deluded that all of these women are making it. And just because their businesses aren't failing doesn't mean they don't go under, because there's almost nothing there to go under. They're baking cookies from their home, or they're taking in childcare workers, or they're, knitting socks in Newfoundland. And this is the kind of thing that is women as entrepreneurs. So we have to look at this in a broad, broad picture. There are some success stories, and there will be some women who will do well, and it can be good for them. But for the vast majority, it is a hoax. And it's a hoax that really serves the government well. If we are not in the labor force looking for a job, we don't collect unemployment insurance, we're not on unemployment statistics. We look good for them. And more women entrepreneurs are created. So you'll hear Barbara McDougall on CBC Airways across the country telling people, women entrepreneurs, we are creating a good climate for women entrepreneurs. They do not fail, and so on. Be wary.